Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post, coming to you from Rio de Janeiro. Brazil is more than 2 years into a series of political crises that have already led to the downfall of one government, that of former President Dilma Rousseff, and may well topple another, led by current President Michel Temer. We're in Rio rather than the capital, Brasilia, because as many people here will tell you, this is where the real power lies in Brazil. Because Rio is where you will find the headquarters of Rede Globo, the biggest, most powerful media conglomerate in South America, a news organization with the kind of influence that media barons like Rupert Murdoch in the US and Great Britain or Silvio Berlusconi in Italy can only dream of. In addition to Globo, we're going to look at Rede TV, the second biggest network in the country, whose owner also founded a church that claims almost 2 million followers in Brazil and 8 million worldwide. We'll examine broadcasting regulations in Brazil, which compared to other countries are slack. Less regulation means fewer rules, not an ideal recipe for responsible journalism. And ultimately, we'll look at the issue of diversity. Who gets on Brazilian TV? Not just the news side, but also the entertainment sector. For a country in which more than half the population can trace its roots to Africa, most of the time, the broadcast output looks lily-white. The media matter, and while the ongoing political power struggles racking Brazil began with a case of state corruption, the so-called car wash scandal, Brazilian news outlets, starting with Globo, have played a critical role in this story and its political aftermath.
The media has become a political player that is powerful enough to influence public opinion. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the media took a very clear political position against the governments in power, and the country became divided in two, between those who supported the previous government and those who didn't want it to remain in power.
It was Globo that put thousands and thousands of people in the streets to demonstrate against President Dilma.
Na cobertura do esporte, vamos falar das manifestações que acontecem pelo país.
That's political, not journalistic work. It acted like a political party.
At the summit of the Brazilian media oligarchy stand the Marinhos, the richest family in the country and the owners of Globo. Globo's conglomerate beams out programming nationwide, from the Amazon in the north to Iguaçu Falls in the south. And its flagship newscast, Jornal Nacional, is an agenda-setting, broadcasting institution. And Globo is more than a national TV network. In addition to its 122 regionally affiliated TV stations, it owns radio networks and a 24-hour news channel. It distributes other broadcasters' channels on its own satellite, in addition to owning the newspapers that gave the company its start back in 1925. There's a well-known political maxim here in Brazil that sums up just how powerful, how influential Globo has become. It goes like this: if Globo doesn't show it, it didn't happen.
Jornal Nacional is without any doubt the highest quality news program in the country. It is also extremely conservative, both politically and socially. There are also numerous examples of politicians having timed specific decisions and speeches so that they might appear on Jornal Nacional on the same day.
Boa tarde, Renata. Boa tarde a todos. Havia uma grande expectativa em torno deste pronunciamento do presidente Michel Temer.
Jornal Nacional remains the most significant national media power associated with political power.
Associado ao poder político.
Consider for a moment that only 50% of Brazilians have internet access and that the remaining 50% are the poorest of the population. You can understand why television has become the most important information source. Globo is the most significant economic and political player in the industry, not only because it's the most watched and farthest reaching, but also because it's the media group that has been most favoured by the Brazilian state throughout history.
Globo and the military government that took power in Brazil in the 1994 coup had a symbiotic relationship. Globo backed that coup and supported the military dictatorship right through until 1985.
All you need to do is read the headlines of the O Globo newspaper from the days following the coup. They were celebrating the fall of a constitutional government, of an elected government. They supported the coup.
The military government put their support behind a media group that was still growing. And they facilitated that growth, partly by providing public funds and partly by not imposing any rules against the concentration of ownership.
No Brasil desde os anos 60.
De 10 meses.
In 2013, almost 30 years after the end of military rule, Globo apologized for backing the coup, but not for its coverage of the regime that followed.
E há também o reconhecimento de erros, como o apoio editorial ao golpe militar de 1964.
And Globo produced some of its most infamous journalism during that 21-year period. In January 1984, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators took to the streets of São Paulo demanding a return to democracy. Globo could not ignore the story, but instead of reporting the facts, it told its viewers that what they were watching was a celebration.
Festa em São Paulo. A cidade comemorou seus 430 anos com mais de 500 solenidades.
In 1989, in Brazil's first national election in more than 2 decades, a debate took place between Globo's favored candidate, Fernando Collor, and the leftist candidate, Lula da Silva. Actually, there were 2 debates, the one that really happened and the version Globo edited heavily and put on the air.
The way the debate was edited was one of the biggest scandals in Brazilian television history.
Reveja agora alguns momentos do debate.
It showed the best of Collor and the worst of Lula.
Está uma candidatura que esposa teses estranhas ao nosso meio, teses marxistas.
After some time, Globo's owners became disenchanted with Collor, and so they campaigned to get him impeached.
Que levou ao impeachment do Collor.
No caso do Grupo Globo,
it's not only Globo, it is also true of all the other mainstream media groups that they have been aligned historically with politically conservative interests that defend the status quo, supporting the interests of the dominant elite in Brazil. If you make a historical analysis, they continue to act the same, representing the same interests.
Os mesmos interesses.
That's what many Brazilians saw in the movement that brought down President Dilma Rousseff last year. Globo and other like-minded media groups campaigning to overthrow a democratically elected government.
O ritmo das bombas políticas que estão caindo sobre Brasília é ritmo quase diário.
A counter-movement against media outlets with political agendas was born. Globo's reporters in the field were confronted with accusations of backing a coup.
Com esse pedido de prisão.
A golpe in Portuguese. At the same time, a term was popularized. Media outlets were called Partido da Imprensa Golpista, which translates to Party of the Pro-Coup Press. Brazil's powerful media monopolies have grown into what they are, largely because of a regulatory vacuum. There is no broadcast regulator here, which is extraordinary for a country of this size. There's no law preventing politicians from owning media outlets, so many of them do. Many countries ban media cross-ownership, the same proprietor owning multiple media outlets in the same market. Again, Brazil has no such law. In fact, the closest thing to a law regulating the media in this country was passed more than half a century ago.
1963. And why? Because that's the way Globo wants. Every time a Brazilian congressman tried to change that, had his character assassinated by Globo. There is no law. The law is whatever Globo wants to do.
When this issue, the possibility of regulation, was raised in Brazil a few years ago, you know what the reaction was from the media? They said this was tantamount to censorship. They sold the idea that the government wanted to censor the media.
Censura travestida de regulação da mídia. A Dilma agora estuda criar uma agência reguladora da mídia nos moldes de Portugal. É piada pronta.
Esse é um argumento que é usado pelos grupos que não
That's the argument used by the groups who oppose regulation. They accuse anyone who wants to end this oligopoly of trying to censor the content. There is a provision in the Brazilian constitution that says that media cannot be a monopoly or an oligopoly. In fact, if that had ever been written into regulation, we wouldn't be in the situation we find ourselves today.
Então, a Constituição brasileira
The Constitution prohibits politicians from controlling broadcasters, but there's no legislation to enforce that. So there are 40 politicians in Brazil who directly own radio and TV stations. You're the mayor of a city, and you also own the main newspaper, radio or TV station. You use the media to remain in power, or you reach power and then you acquire media outlets and use what should be a public service for your own political benefit.
Para o seu benefício político.
Hoje, que sentido faz você?
What sense does it make these days to fill broadcasting with rules, when at the same time you have the internet and heaps of unregulated content? Regulation does not keep up with the evolution of technology. It makes no sense saying that the system is dominated by one party, pointing and saying, but that network has 40% of the market. Of course, someone is always going to be first, and someone will always come last. It doesn't make sense to regulate television when you can go online and see whatever you want.
Lula and Dilma had not the political courage to face Globo. They say that they didn't have the political consensus or the political power to do that, but in the end, when Dilma was kicked out of power, they recognized that they had made their greatest mistake.
O presidente da Câmara, Eduardo Cunha, acaba de anunciar que acolheu pedido de abertura de processo de impeachment contra a presidente Dilma Rousseff.
They blinked and Globo kicked them out of power.
We contacted Globo to give the company a chance to respond to its critics. It chose not to. Globo does have its competitors, all of them owned by wealthy families or individuals. However, plurality in media ownership here has failed to deliver a plurality of views. Media owners in Brazil are, without exception, white and conservative. They compete for audiences, but do so mostly from the same political and social points of view.
TV Brasil, diferente que nem você.
Brazil did not even have a publicly owned TV broadcaster until 10 years ago, when Dilma Rousseff's predecessor, the aforementioned Lula da Silva, was president. He created EBC over the objections of private media owners. Having got its start decades after its competitors, EBC has a lot of catching up to do. Its ratings are microscopic, less than a 1% share. When it was launched, conservatives called EBC Lula TV. They can't even do that anymore. Last year, President Temer appointed one of his political allies to run the channel. One organization that changed the ownership formula on the private side is a TV network called Record. Its owner is a billionaire, Edir Macedo, who doubles as a church bishop. He is the founder of the Universal Church of the Kingdom of God, one of Brazil's biggest evangelical churches and one of the fastest growing churches of its kind anywhere in the world. Brazil's version of televangelism, the use of TV channels by religious figures to reach new audiences, got its start in the 1990s. Various churches, like Macedo's, rented airtime on conventional channels, like Record TV.
Uma vida melhor espera por você.
The televangelists saw their congregations grow and raked in more and more donations. By 1989, Macedo no longer needed to rent airtime by the hour. He and his church had the financial muscle to buy Record outright.
You can guess what happens next. When you have a TV network, you have power. Edir Macedo isn't in government, but he has power because he has a TV network. He speaks to millions of people.
Assim diz o Senhor.
So anyone running for election in Brazil has no choice but to ask for the blessings of Edir Macedo and the other preachers, because they speak to a huge number of people who are all voters. So then everyone goes to kiss Edir Macedo's hand, not just the right-wing parties, but the left too.
A direita e a esquerda.
When Edir Macedo and the Universal Church acquired Record, it caused a chain reaction. From then on, a race was established in Brazil among other churches to also get TV stations. With the economic crisis, private television channels increased the practice of renting out airtime to religious groups who can pay. So the crisis has ended up pushing private television into the arms of these churches.
E o discurso
And the discourse spread by many of these religious leaders is very hostile to those of African heritage, to women's rights.
Nós estamos mostrando às pessoas que isso aqui, olha só, meu, olha só, aqui, isso aqui não funciona, aqui, isso aqui não é.
Hekorji specifically has criminalized Afro-Brazilian religions, portraying them as devil worship. Some groups have actually won legal cases against Hekorji, forcing them to broadcast programs which treat these religions with more respect.
De maneira respeitosa sobre essas religiões.
Eu posso afirmar
I can categorically say that these neo-Pentecostal evangelical churches are the pinnacle of extreme right-wing reactionary attitudes in Brazil today.
Mais a extrema-direita no Brasil atualmente.
One might think that Brazil's church-owned or affiliated TV channels would not have that much in common with Globo and other purely commercial outlets. However, the content isn't all that different. The programming is just as loud, women are objectified in much the same way, and whether the channel is owned by a businessman in a pinstripe suit or someone broadcasting from an electronic pulpit, the politics tend to follow the same lines.
The Brazilian elite doesn't want to lose a single centimeter of its privilege. It's a very selfish elite, and I'm not even talking about a political elite. I'm talking about the true elite, which is positioned well above this. And yes, what I'm talking about is the people who own the mainstream media.
Then there are the twin issues of diversity and depiction. 54% of the Brazilian population is of African descent. You can see the legacy of the slave trade in the faces here. Brazil was the last country in the Western world to abolish slavery. It did so in 1888, 20 years after the U.S. did. But despite the fact that more than half this country has African roots, you may have noticed that almost all of the faces that you have seen so far in the clips that we've shown you from Brazilian television, either corporate media or religious channels, have one thing in common. They're white.
If you turn on the TV in Brazil, there are hardly any black actors or presenters, hardly any black journalists. This is across all of the mainstream channels. We are not seen there. The invisibility of black people in spaces of power is glaring.
Just go to the newsroom of any newspaper or television station and look at the journalists working there. Almost all of them are white. So the coverage of black people on television or in the Brazilian news must go through the hands and the work of the white journalist.
This kind of television reinforces stereotypes all the time. It reinforces the myth of racial democracy and that everyone has rights and equality and everything is okay.
So when certain issues are covered, for example, when we try to raise the issue of black genocide, that every 23 minutes a young black person is murdered in Brazil, how does it end up being portrayed? It's always shootouts in the peripheries and the criminals were killed. There isn't even a narrative that serves to inform the public of the facts in Brazil, a country that was the last in the world to abolish slavery.
The depiction of that Brazilian reality does not just occur in news programming. The same can be seen on the entertainment side and the Brazilian soap operas known as telenovelas. Telenovelas are an integral part of the Brazilian media story for reasons both social and financial. A successful telenovela will capture huge audiences, routinely in the tens of millions. Their plot twists will drive everyday conversation in Brazil. For the networks producing them, all of which faced the economic challenges born of the digital revolution, telenovelas are still cash cows. One of them, Globo's Avenida Brasil, reportedly delivered ad revenues of about $1 billion.
Avenida Brasil.
And telenovelas have something that Brazilian news programs do not. They have international reach. Globo's flagship newscast, Jornal Nacional, dominates domestic news ratings here, but relatively few people outside Brazil will ever see it. Telenovelas are an export industry. Avenida Brasil has been transmitted in 130 countries in 19 languages. In that respect, telenovelas are the face that Brazil shows to the world. And much like the country's newscasters, the faces that get shown are nothing less than a misrepresentation of what Brazil really is. Because again, they're mostly white.
In the soap operas of Brazil, we have a rich world, a happy world, a white world. What is it that a soap opera does? It enters the general public's home and tells a child who is still growing up what they are not going to be. The places they cannot reach. Brazilian private television does this every day. Every day.
For
example, in adaptations of books in which the main characters are black, when they make them into TV series, they cast them as white.
E de que me adianta querer? Sou uma escrava, uma fugitiva.
And when we ask, why did you put a white actor to play the role of a black character? They say, it doesn't make a difference. And this has happened in some very famous series in Brazil in the past, like Isaura, the slave, and Chiquinha Gonzaga.
A senhora Dona Isabel toca piano? Há alguém no Rio de Janeiro que não toque? Os escravos. Hã? Os escravos não tocam piano.
It may not happen today, because now we have a platform where we are able to protest. Because of the internet, we can make some noise.
After a lot of pressure from the black movement, you can see, little by little, black actors gaining leading roles in soap operas.
Uma o quê? Vamos, complete a frase. Uma negra, não é isso que você ia dizer?
However, it is an illusion to think that placing a black person on television solves the problem. The way that black people are portrayed in most of the mainstream media follows and legitimizes the structural racism that we have in Brazil.
Because the successful world, the world that works, is white. And then when the commercials come on, a white person comes along as the representative of buying power, of acquisitive power.
É hora de valorizar quem carrega o país nas costas. Nova Chevrolet S10 2018.
And then afterwards, when the news comes on, there's a black person robbing, there's a black person being arrested.
Entrevista exclusiva, dos chefes do tráfico de drogas da região.
So every day, private television in Brazil attacks Brazilians.
Finally, back to Globo and the story of the Brazilian TV beauty queen Nayara Justino. As examples of media malpractice in this country go, it is nowhere near the worst, but it is revealing. The title, Mulata Globaleza, was created by Globo. It's a beauty contest tied to its coverage of Brazil's annual carnival. That word, mulata, which some say has its roots in the word mula, meaning mule, is considered racist. A word loaded with colonial connotations, chosen by Globo for a beauty contest ostensibly held to celebrate racial integration. Viewers get to vote for the Globaleza, and 2014 marked a first. The winner, Nayara Justino, was dark-skinned and unmistakably black.
A Globeleza 2014 é Nayara.
Not everyone approved. Online trolls called Justino a monkey, a darky. A few months later, Globo had Justino replaced. It set the results of the vote aside and simply picked another woman. Globo insisted that its decision had nothing to do with skin color, that the choice came down to artistic fitness for the role. It said artistic merit prevails. The woman Globo picked to replace Justino had African roots as well, but her skin tone is much lighter. And, as one of the country's relatively few newsreaders of African descent will tell you, in the Brazilian media, racial integration has its limits.
I'm a black woman, but I have a skin tone that is a little lighter. And I can say that I am privileged in this, because the darker your skin is, the more you have to suffer in Brazil.
There
was an official whitening policy in Brazil. The initiative that brought European immigrants here after the abolition of slavery was not accidental. It was done in order to whiten the population, because they believed that within 200 years, there would be no more blacks in Brazil. But we're still here, in this country, which still denies its African origins, and which runs on the idea that the whiter, the better.
In a way, the story of that beauty queen typifies the way Globo sees Brazil. Back in 1964, the network supported a military coup that brought down a government Brazilians had voted for. 2 years ago, Globo called its viewers onto the streets to help depose another democratically elected government. Globo is not even above overturning a public vote for a beauty queen if the choice of the people fails to align with the network's idea of who should represent Brazil. You've been watching a special edition of our program on the Brazilian media, who they are not, and the influence they wield in this, the world's 5th most populous country. We'll see you next time, here at the Listening Post.
Nós interrompemos a programação para informar que o prefeito de Salomão, o usuário da Igreja Universal Reino de Deus,
maior, mais moderno centro de produção de televisão da América Latina.
Que esta revista morre há anos.